Zelensky claims that the U.S. has given the Russians and the Ukrainians until June to end the conflict. Now, I say Zelensky claimed, right? No one is actually saying that Donald Trump said it. Zelensky is the only one who came out and say that they've given them an ultimatum, June deadline to end the conflict. Now, everything Zelensky says is the word of God, but they are being more careful now because they know very well that you cannot force Russia to do anything. But they're not going to tell you that out loud because that's embarrassing. Imagine yourself telling the United States to their face that, look, you have no leverage on Russia. The truth is that they've gave a deadline to Ukraine. That is more like it because we've seen deadlines given to Russia before. Trump, when he first came in and, he thought he was all of that, right? He was, elected with flying colors, right? And he thought he was controlling the world. And he said, he gives Putin 2 weeks. He had to learn the hard way that you don't give Putin no deadline. There's not one person on this planet who can scare Putin. It doesn't exist. So he learned the hard way. So that is why you're not hearing the White House saying that they gave Russia and Ukraine a deadline to end the conflict. Even the mainstream propaganda has received the instruction not to go there and say that Trump actually said. So everybody's saying, well, Zelensky's the one saying it. Also very important, Zelensky saying that Trump said that if they don't end the conflict in June, Trump is going to put pressure on both of them. Here goes Zelensky lying again. They cannot put pressure on Russia. They're going to put pressure on Ukraine. There's more likely that if Trump said anything like that they're considering removing their support from Ukraine because Ukraine is the only one who's, begging for support from the US and Europe. And they want to compare themselves to Russia. Some of the craziest thing I've seen with this Ukraine conflict, where the loser compare himself to the winner. There are so many things that you cannot compare between both countries. Russia is making its own weapons. Nobody is funding Russia or sending money so that they can fund their budget or building weapons for them, whatever. No, Russia has always built its own weapons. Russia has the best air defense system on the planet, and they're sanctioned as well. Imagine yourself a country, the most sanctioned country on the planet, but yet they have the most powerful weapons. You imagine this country sanctioned, building its own weapons, making its own money outside of the sanctions, with its own forces, fighting NATO in Ukraine. And then on the other side, you have Ukraine. Beg for money for their budget, beg for money for weapons, beg for money for any sort of production you can imagine. They beg for money for electricity, energy, you name it, they beg for everything. And they claim that they should be seen at the same level with the most sanctioned country on earth that is still able to produce and beat Ukraine and NATO in Ukraine. So we have to be honest with each other on this, right? The reality is that if Donald Trump wants to put an ultimatum or a deadline on someone, it can only be on Ukraine because it is Ukraine that begs for the support of the United States. The United States has its intelligence over there. It has its troops in the flag of mercenaries over there. Intelligence, the CIA is on the ground. You name it, all of them are there. So if Donald Trump wants to put some type of pressure, he's going to say, okay, we stop the support. We stop giving them intelligence. That's the only thing really left because they're no longer giving them money. Biden was the one giving money. They're not giving weapons anymore. The only country that the U.S. can put pressure on is Ukraine. The only country the U.S. can put a deadline on, it is Ukraine. It is not Russia. So Zelensky is lying. Bottom line. On top of this lie, he came up with something else. Now, I could believe that this is true. Zelensky is saying that the Ukraine Intelligence Agency, right? Tell you the truth, I didn't even know that Ukraine had an intelligence agency, right? Ukraine is no longer a country. So when they say things like Ukraine's intelligence agency, I just laugh because, it's just funny. Right? So they came up with a report, or whatever, a publication saying that the United States and Russia have a secret deal of $12 trillion. This deal involves the reconstruction of Ukraine by American companies, investment in the Donbass, where Ukraine used to have most of its natural resources. Now it belongs to Russia, so the only person you can deal with is Russia, right? And so the Ukrainian intelligence agency, right, whatever that is claiming that this deal took place in September. They talked about it in September when Russia's aide, right, Vladimir Putin, aide who's at the same level as Witkoff, met in Miami, and that they discussed this $12 trillion deal. Now, is this true that there's a secret deal between both countries? Look, I believe that a secret deal between both countries was discussed in Alaska. That's where it started. Everything else that followed is just a continuation of that discussion. I believe in this story more than, the so-called deadline that Zelensky's talking about. Yes, Donald Trump wants to deal with Russia. It's normal. In fact, they've moved past Ukraine. The only thing left now is just to officially say that the Ukraine conflict has ended. What Russia is doing, Vladimir Putin, extremely intelligent, right? What he's doing is putting pressure on Donald Trump to make money. He's basically telling the Trump team, look, there's a lot of money to be made here. A lot. We're talking about the Donbass area, Alaska area where, you have Russia and in the United States, they can cooperate, and there's so much money to be made. And every single time that, Russia is sending its aides, meeting with Witkoff, they're throwing these numbers out there. Look, man, we can make a lot of money. And Donald Trump likes things like this. But Donald Trump knows very well that if he starts anything with Russia without ending the Ukraine conflict, it's going to look bad on him. It's going to be like, well, you came and you say you will end this conflict in 24 hours. What happened? And so they're stuck. And the thing with Vladimir Putin right now is he's right where he wants things to be. Because for Russia, it's not just a matter of getting rid of Ukraine. It's a matter of destroying NATO. It's a matter of completely weakening Europe, specifically the EU. Once the conflict of Ukraine ends, NATO collapses, the EU divides. What is left? Russia, by itself. And Russia at that time could make a deal with single countries in Europe, countries that are ready to make a deal with Russia. And so the situation that we are seeing with Zelensky right now is complete desperation. Zelensky wants attention. So brace yourself. This is what we call the beginning of the end. And the worst part about it is a slow and painful ending of this conflict. Because when it's this slow, it hurts seriously. And that is what Zelensky is going through right now.